Chapter 1, Tom. I was Layla's age the first time I watched a sheep get slaughtered. It was Eid al-Adha, the holiday that celebrates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son to prove his devotion to God. At the last minute, God intervened and provided Abraham a sheep to kill instead. On Eid al-Adha, Muslims celebrate Abraham's unwavering faith and God's mercy by slaughtering an animal, usually a goat or a sheep, and sharing the meat with relatives, neighbors, and the poor. At 6 years old, I knew the story of Abraham. Sometimes I'd scare my younger brother Ali by saying, "Imagine if God didn't stop him, you'd be dead." But for me, the holiday was about something much more important: new clothes and money. For Muslim children, Eid al-Adha is one of the best weeks of the year. No school, new outfits, and at the end of the week, the toy stores open back up for kids to spend their Eid money on various treasures: a soccer ball, water guns, comic books, and pop rocks. That year, we celebrated Eid al-Adha with my dad's side of the family. We called my dad's father Jiddu Riyad, Grandpa Riyad, and his house was in the same neighborhood as ours. We lived in Amman, the capital of Jordan. Amman was built across 7 hills, or jabals, and each hill was its own neighborhood. Our neighborhood, Jabal Amman, was well known for being where the royal family and prime minister lived. Jiddu Riyad's house was across the street from the Qatar embassy. The British, French, and Spanish consulates were just down the road. Because the neighborhood was full of royalty and diplomats, a Jordanian soldier was stationed outside many of the homes, including Jiddu Riyad's. They wore blue berets and held rifles. Jiddu Riyad's house stood like a fort behind a concrete wall, snaking out in all directions, full of dark rooms I had never seen. It had to be a big house because my grandfather had 13 kids, 6 boys and 7 girls, and among them they had dozens of their own children. I grew up in a legion of cousins, and on holidays like Eid al-Adha, all of us, almost without exception, gathered at Jiddu Riyad's to celebrate. It was roomy enough for everyone and modern enough to be comfortable, except for one bathroom that still featured a squat toilet, a porcelain bowl sunk into the floor that required much balance and care. Even though his children complained, my grandfather made a point of keeping this old world fixture. Jiddu Riyad came from a very old village called Salt. Maybe because of this, he sometimes seemed uncomfortable with fancy things. It was important to him to hold on to his customs and traditions of his youth. For most of the day, we would play outside, usually never-ending games of soccer, but also plucking nuts from the pistachio trees and scrambling around the large fountain that was always mysteriously dry. Behind the house and down a set of stone steps, a metal playground gleamed in the desert sun, complete with a seesaw, a slide, swings, and monkey bars. By late morning, the slide would be so searingly hot that we'd have to use old rice sacks to protect our skin from burns. The most exciting part of Eid was when Jiddu Riyad would summon each grandchild to his recliner, where he would dole out money to us one by one. An imposing man, despite his white hair and short stature, Jiddu Riyad's steel factories had made him a millionaire and quite prominent in Amman. He was feared and respected in his own family and throughout the city. Normally he was serious and reserved, but handing out gifts to his grandchildren made him glow with delight. Because I was the oldest child in my family and the oldest grandchild of Jiddu Riyad's second wife, I often received more money than my cousins. It was my responsibility to care for my younger siblings, and many years I'd organize a pool between us so we could afford a more valuable gift from the toy store, something we could share. After the money was handed out, we would assemble in the family dining room for a feast of mensef, lamb simmered in yogurt and served over rice. Mensef is not only my favorite meal, but also the national dish of Jordan. It is served on the holiest days of the Muslim calendar and has been used for centuries as peace offerings between tribes. Mensef is always served from a massive communal dish and eaten with the hands. When we ate mensef, we didn't sit at the table, we stood around it, sleeves rolled up, reaching into the platter for fistfuls of rice. The meat served on Eid al-Adha comes from the animal that had been sacrificed that day, and each year my grandfather hired men to slaughter 13 sheep for his 13 children. Most families only sacrifice a lamb for every son, just as Abraham did. But because our family was so well off, it was expected that we would distribute a greater amount of meat to the poor. I had never given much thought to the lamb in our mansaf until that year, the year I turned 7, and my cousin Hussein suggested we go watch the men as they performed the ritual. Hussein was 4 years older than the group of cousins I tended to play with, confident and cocky. I didn't really want to watch whatever happened outside, but I didn't want Hussein to think I was scared either. I took my younger brother Ali by the hand, and together we followed Hussein to the backyard. We chose the flat, elevated area, a spot where we normally played cards or marbles. From there, we were only about 10 feet from the playground, where 3 men were sharpening long, sword-like knives. They were dressed in loose-fitting gray linen and wore keffiyehs, the traditional Arab headdress. Behind them, a pack of dirty white sheep stood together in a line, looking oblivious. "So they'll slit the throat, and you'll see all this blood drain," said Hussein with annoying authority. I could tell now that he had brought us here simply to show off how smart and tough he thought he was. "And the sheep will kick and make these crying noises, and then they'll hang it upside down on the hook, and all the blood will come out, and then the sheep will stop making noises and die. It's not scary, just watch." I squeezed Ali. He was only 5, his dark hair trimmed into a perfect bowl cut. "Get ready to close your eyes," I whispered. I didn't want him to embarrass us in front of Hussein. "Whatever you do, don't scream." I kept my hands on his shoulders so that I could cover his mouth if he did. Below us, the men clinked their knives together and prayed in unison. As 2 of the men sandwiched the first sheep between their legs, I took a deep breath. The man in the front pulled the animal's head back and in one sharp motion drew his knife across its neck. Just as Hussein had promised, a curtain of blood poured from the wound, instantly soaking the dusty ground and the bottom of the man's pants. As the sheep shuddered and groaned, the second man quickly wrapped a rope around its back leg and flipped it upside down. With little struggle, he hung the animal on an S-shaped hook that was dangling from the monkey bars. For a few long seconds, it kicked and screeched and swung chaotically, blood raining down everywhere, creating dark pools in the dirt. Then all at once, it went silent and still, and the men bowed their heads in prayer. It was as if my mouth and throat had been stuffed with wool. We weren't supposed to pray when we were dirty. I knew that, and we weren't supposed to kill things or hurt them either. Everything that was happening in front of me was wrong. I let go of Ali's shoulders and pushed past Hussein. I knew the men would not question me. They were my grandfather's employees. I marched past the swings and the slide and snatched the rope of the first sheep I came to. "What are you doing?" I heard Hussein yell behind me. "This one's mine. I'm taking it," I shouted back. "Where are you taking it?" "They are not going to kill my sheep. I'm taking it inside Jiddo's house. It can live there." "Put it back before you get in trouble." "No." The sheep followed without protest as I led it toward the house. I knew I couldn't walk into the dining room with it. All of the adults were gathered there. Instead, I made my way to the door that we almost never used, the one that opened to Jiddo Riyad's formal living room, a space reserved solely for entertaining important guests, not for children, and certainly not for sheep. Inside, red and black rugs were layered over the concrete floor, filling the room with a raw and dusty smell. Shafts of mid-afternoon sunlight took aim through the windows, and plush cushions sat ready for visitors. I threw myself down on one of them. For the first time, I looked at the sheep, now eye level. "It's going to be okay," I told it. I petted its tangled, wiry coat. Hussein and Ali were the first to arrive, but soon more cousins streamed in. Then my father was there, my mother too. "Luma," my father said, "what is going on?" "There is blood everywhere. They can't kill this sheep," I argued. "It's mine." You need to take the sheep outside right now. Jiddo will not be okay with this." Next to him, my mother, a strict vegetarian, stood with her arm crossed in a show of solidarity with my dad, but I swear I saw a smirk pass over her lips. "What's going on?" My grandfather's voice came from the door. My father stepped out of Jiddo's way. Everyone always stepped out of Jiddo's way. "Jiddo, I know we're supposed to kill sheep for Eid, but you cannot kill Tom. Perhaps if the sheep had a name, I reasoned, Jiddo Riyad would be less likely to slaughter it. The only animals I knew were the ones on TV, and at that time, Tom and Jerry were my favorite cartoon. "Tom?" Jiddo Riyad repeated, looking confused. My grandfather rarely spoke English. The Western name sounded weird coming from his mouth. "Yes, this is Tom. and I don't want him to die. There are enough sheep we are killing today, and I love Tom. You have a big house, he can live here with you. I wondered, could a sheep use a squat toilet? The room seemed to fill with a thick tension, like a balloon about to burst, as everyone waited for Jidoriad to reprimand me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hussein put his hand over his mouth. My father shook his head in shame. My mother said nothing. And then Jidoriad did something no one expected him to do. He laughed. His laughter seemed to give everyone else permission to do the same. Okay, we will keep Tom, he said to me. And then to my father, you have your hands full with this one. As the adults filed out, my cousins gathered around Tom and me, laughing and petting the lucky sheep. When it was time to eat, I left Tom in the living room, satisfied that he would be safe and comfortable while we ate the family meal. I know now that my grandfather let Tom stay for a few days. What happened to him afterward, I can only imagine. When the platter of mensaf was placed at the kids' table, we stood around and scooped rice with our hands. Every time I reached for the lamb, though, my cousins would push the plate just out of reach. What are you doing? I asked, irritated. You can't eat Jerry, Hussein said with a haughty sneer. The rest of my cousins giggled. You're a jerk, I said. Luma, come here, Jidoriad beckoned from the adult table. Come stand next to me. The invitation surprised me. My grandfather always stood at the head of the table. Whoever was invited to eat next to him was considered the guest of honor. Typically, it was a person about to graduate or get married. Even at 7 years old, I understood how meaningful Jidoriad's gesture was. Yes, Jiddo, I said obediently. Jidoriad gathered me in the crook of his arm. With his other hand, he formed a small ball of rice and lovingly placed it near my lips. I smiled and took a bite. I hoped Hussein was watching. Here, Jiddo said, reaching for one of the lamb bones. He was offering me the marrow, the delicacy that adults usually argued over. My cousins had tried marrow. They said it was gross. Sure enough, it looked oily and brown like spoiled pudding. But now, with all eyes on me, my revered grandfather holding me affectionately, what felt right and what was right seemed very far apart. I didn't want to eat one of those innocent animals that had died on the playground, but I was hungry, and I didn't want to disappoint my family. I tipped my head back and sucked the marrow straight from the bone.